Colour shift. It's one of those techniques that's infuriating but so easy to pull off if you have a little bit of experience. In this video I'll show you the best methods for getting that colour shift of your choice. The Dark Eldar are the most crazed, depraved version of their race. This colour scheme is a reflection of that culture that's so alien that even their base metallics are corrupted. So we start with a base coat of Scale 75 Black Primer. Then on top of this we use Magnesium from Vallejo Metal Colour. I only add a pinch of Life Colour Thinner into the mixture to make sure that the mechanism doesn't seize up. These paints have been specifically formulated to be used via an airbrush, so they do not need additional thinning down. Again, the acrylic thinner is only there to stop the mechanism seizing up and attempt to stop dry tip. When paint shoots through the airbrush, there's a natural accumulation at the end of the tip, and that's what causes dry tip, and that can cause sputs and sputtering to it. Okay, first coat. As you can see, it's not particularly clean, the edge I'm trying to create here. I'm using the miniature to my advantage, airbrushing at an angle to preserve the shadow, but there's still quite a lot of graininess to this. This is all structure at the moment. One thing I try and impress on new students, and if this is one of your first videos, welcome. If it's one of your 100th, I'm sure you've heard me say this again and again and again, but the two V's, volumes and values. These are the two things we want to concentrate on in the initial brush strokes or airbrush strokes with the miniature. After this, the pre-coat, which this is, instead of using a pre-coat with white on top of black, we're using metallics. We'll be using pale burnt metal to build this up to a bright lustrous sheen, which should be coming up right now. So instead of using pure white, or a version of pure white, which would be, I guess, aluminium or white metal, we're instead using a slightly more nuanced colour palette with a darker, more Balkan metal-esque silver to begin with, and then one of my favourite colours in the range, pale burnt metal, which has a ever so slight amount of yellow to pigment it. Again, I'm airbrushing at 20 psi. I never modulate the air pressure whatsoever. It's all trigger control, and I want to hit the very edges of the armour plate. So I'm dragging it back and forth. I'm using the airbrush quite quickly over the surface, and I'm not really aiming at the miniature itself, I'm aiming at my fingers, and the overspill should clip the edge of the vehicle to give me a really nice sharp line. Right, again I'm using the miniature to my advantage. I'm not just blasting it directly from above, I'm moving it so it preserves that shadow on the inner dip of the vehicle chassis. Next up we have my Flaming Homer moment. Black ink is applied in 2 to 3 layers across the entirety of the vehicle. Now it's very important that we do allow this to completely utterly settle after each layer is added before we apply the next. We do not want to add 2 or 3 layers successively over one another, because if the paint isn't dry it won't absorb any new layers and it will just end up messy, and we run the risk of tide marks. Now the paint needs to be very thin here. Thin, capital thin. 1 part ink to 4 to 6 parts thinner. And this mixture is applied across the entirety of the chassis. Again, it is very important that we allow each layer to completely dry before moving on to the next. You can speed this up with a hairdryer, or because the layers are so thin, they do dry relatively quickly. The shadows are reinforced and more layers of the black ink are applied there as opposed to the top highlights, especially those areas that were given a hit of pale burnt metal. So the pale burnt metal have 1 coat, the shadows receive 2 to 3. Okay, magic trick coming up. Gloss varnish is applied across the entirety of the vehicle, and we need to allow this to completely cure. So we need to allow about 5 minutes, at least, at the very least, to dry. Now, you shouldn't really use this airbrush in the manner that I am. I'm just impatient. Since this has quite a small nozzle, I would recommend a larger, maybe a Hadron Steenbeck 0.4, 0.35 for this procedure. But impatient me, I'm yanking back on this very expensive, delicate piece of equipment to force gloss varnish out onto this. Oh, I'm cringing watching myself do this. Yeah, use a crappy airbrush for this. Not that Hadron Steenbeck's crappy at all, just has a bigger nozzle. Right, the magic trick, Psychotic Illusions from Green Stuff World is applied in this instance. Applied into the top of the airbrush. Completely and utterly neat. I'm not using any thinner, nothing whatsoever. And I need to apply 2 to 3 coats, and that should do the trick. Now, again, very important when I say 2 to 3 layers, we allow each layer to dry before moving on to the next. Has to dry, must dry before moving on to the next. Otherwise, we run the risk of clogging the sculpt and just creating tide marks, etc, etc. It doesn't look good. And you can see the effect that's had. Now, by having the metallic pre-shade and by having the ink, it creates a much more satisfying overall pull with the colour shift effect. It does advise, or Green Stuff will certainly advise, that you put it on top of a black base coat and you build up from there. I found while this does work, it doesn't lead to anywhere near as dramatic as a colour shift as this or the preceding techniques lead to. And feel free to not only use the Green Stuff World colour shift paints, Vallejo I've heard excellent things about, and I'll probably be trying those soon. But that is it. Guide to colour shift paints. Hope you've enjoyed that nice, sweet, short tutorial. Thank you very much, guys. I'll catch you in the next video.